Channel 7, Buffalo.
Bjorn Borg and Billie Jean, Spectacular Bid, Reggie Jackson and Roger Staubach, Eric Heiden, Muhammad Ali. Would it surprise you to remember that all of those competed in the 1980s?
In the era of the Gipper, the saying was changed just a little bit. It was Win One for Magic, Boom Boom, Dr. J, Bear, The Fridge, Marvelous, The Boss, Macho, Sweetness, Hitman, Ice Cube.
Len Bias was a victim of the world of recreational drugs that swept over all society in the 1980s. But Ben Johnson was the prime symbol of steroids, vocational drugs that sports still hasn't learned how to cope with.
The 80s had big games, big salaries, yuppies, excess, seemingly endless growth. But only one guy stood up and said, "Enough already, no mas."
Hi, I'm Frank Deford.
And I'm Jim Gray, and this is the decade in sports, the 80s.
Is brought to you by Budweiser. Beechwood aged for that clean, crisp taste. This Bud's for you. And by the U.S. Marine Corps. The few, the proud, the Marines.
Welcome to the decade in sports, the 1980s. I'm Jim Gray, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Frank Deford, the editor-in-chief of The National. Frank?
Thank you, Jim, and welcome. And one thing I've become more and more aware of is how significant sport really is in the modern culture. Oh, of course, the outcome of one particular game doesn't matter at all. But sport in toto really counts.
Frank, I think you're right. What we've seen is that society mirrors sports, and sports mirrors society. Its threads have been woven throughout the decade. On the downside, there's been corruption, cheating, steroids, and drugs. But on the upside, sports has been very uplifting, and we've seen a globalization of sports. And, you know, the reality of the whole thing to me, Frank, is that sports is a big business, and it really has a major effect on both the players and the fans.
True enough, and I'm going to sound a little Pollyannish here, a little Bo Peep. But I really believe that sports can bring us together. I was in China a couple of years ago, deep in the heart of China. And with the help of a translator, I really was able to connect with the Chinese about a soccer game played 10,000 miles away in Europe on television. It really brought us together.
So you weren't a Bo Peep who lost his sheep?
No, not at all.
Well, that's what we're here to do. We're going to examine the decade. We're going to look at all the fascinating plays, the decade in sports, the 1980s. In professional football, we've seen quite an evolution in the 1980s. We've seen much more of the downfield pass, teams going up top. We've seen Randall Cunningham, John Elway, Dan Marino. A lot of teams throwing the ball quite a bit more these days, Frank, but we've also had a lot of action off the field.
Oh, sure, that goes with football. In 1982, we had the long 57-day strike. Then the USFL rose and quickly fell, finally going out of business in 86. The next year in the NFL, we had the replacement strike where they brought in the scabs, and finally this year a change in commissioners. But whatever happens to football, it's always the most exciting games on the field.
And maybe nothing more exciting than all the way back in the 81-82 season. It's become the catch. It may be the most famous play of the decade. It put the 49ers into the Super Bowl as they beat the Cowboys in the NFC title game. Dwight Clark from Joe Montana, 28-27.
And you know, it's amazing. Of all the catches in the world, this is the one, as you say, that is the catch. Can't say any more about a play.
It's etched in our minds indelibly. The 49ers then went on to win their first of 3 Super Bowls in the 1980s, and the guard had changed. It was the signaling of the changing guard in the NFL. The Steelers and the Dolphins were no longer to be the teams on top. The Raiders had to step aside because here come the 49ers as they beat Cincinnati 26-21. Then it was on to December of 1982, the very famous snowplow play. This play will live forever in the hearts of the Patriot fans, and It'll probably live forever in Don Shula's mind, too, as Ron Meyer pulled out his old snowplow, and that was it. Bingo. Instant field goal. No more snow. Then in that same season, it was John Riggins and the Hogs, as they were known, Frank. They went on to defeat Miami in the Super Bowl. It was the Redskins' first Super Bowl victory, 27-17.
By that time, the NFC was completely in charge. What had been an AFC in the 80s and the 70s, by now the NFC was in charge and still remains that way.
That's right, and that onslaught continued in October of 1984 season when Walter Payton set a new career rushing record. He broke Jim Brown's all-time record, but more importantly to Walter Payton at that time, he had established the Bears, and he was on his way to the championship ring as the Fridge, and who will ever forget this character, and Jim McMahon and the headband. And Mike Ditka led the Bears to a 15-1 regular season and a Super Bowl victory as they totally annihilated New England 46-10. Buddy Ryan and Mike Ditka carried off the field.
You know, it broke my heart when the Bears didn't continue. I love that team. I think everybody loved that team. I think that team appealed to people who weren't just sports fans. And I never understood how they just sort of lost it all in the next year.
And the magic seemingly has disappeared. But it came back to Washington in 1988 with Doug Williams leading his team, the first black quarterback to start a Super Bowl, and they beat the Denver Broncos. The Broncos came out and scored on their first offensive possession, their first play, but that was it. It was a 42-10 annihilation. The Broncos dropped their second straight Super Bowl.
It's hard to believe that at the beginning of this decade, there was no such thing as a black quarterback, never mind one leading his team to victory in the Super Bowl.
And now we have Randall Cunningham, Doug Williams, and it's no longer black quarterbacks. They're just quarterbacks, and I think we've all been looking for that day.
And beyond that, we've even got a black coach now in our show.
Art Shell, of course, the glory years with the Oakland Raiders, and the team on the other side of the bay was able to dominate in 1989 as Joe Montana led his team 92 yards on their final drive, and he finally hooked up with John Taylor to beat Cincinnati in the Super Bowl.
And with that victory in the Super Bowl last year by the 49ers, I think it left no doubt whatsoever in anybody's mind. Team of the decade, 49ers, not only that, player of the decade, Joe Montana, coach of the decade, Bill Walsh.
I would have to agree with that. But, you know, I kind of like this thing about parity. Pete Rozelle's famous words of many years ago, on any given Sunday, any team can win. I think that worked throughout the decade. A lot of teams had a lot of interest.
Oh, I don't agree with you there, Jim. I think that movie stars sell movies and great teams sell leagues. You need the great teams to really create the interest in fans.
I think that's right. But if you don't have a great team, then everybody's all the same. I think parity is good for 27 of 28 teams because if you don't have a rabbit out there and nobody's chasing the great team, if there's not a carrot out there, then nobody knows who to cheer for and who to beat. So you always have to have a great team. And with a great team like we've had the Bears and we've had the 49ers, everybody's known who to chase.
Parity is a fun thing to talk about. Something that's not a fun thing to talk about is drugs. We'll be back with that in just a moment.
It began as a game. It turned into a battle. And now, it's out of control. Bud Bowl 2, coming January 28th. This time, it's war. You know the sinking feeling of a dead battery.
Mommy, what's wrong? Stay in the car.
Now there's the revolutionary Die-Hard Dual Start. It's two Die-Hard batteries in one. A simple twist taps its built-in spare Die-Hard, so you're not left stranded.
Mom, you fixed it.
It's cutting-edge technology, and it's Die-Hard. Die-Hard Dual Start. More power when you need it most.
The Big Zero. That's the finance charge at Highland for 1 full year on everything, from audio and video to home office equipment and appliances. 0% for 1 full year. In fact, everything you've ever wanted is at Highland Superstore's 0% financing event, except, of course, the interest payments. And by the way, it's now through Monday only.
If you didn't catch AM Buffalo Friday morning, you missed the first live television interview with Buffalo Sabres owner Seymour Knox and Common Council President George Arthur on the team's request for a new arena.
Plus, reaction to the sensational McMartin preschool sexual abuse trial. We talked to DA Kevin Dillon and a child sexual abuse expert.
If people are talking about it in Western New York, we're talking about it with you on AM Buffalo.
Weekdays live at 10 on Channel 7, making a difference every morning.
Welcome back to the Decade in Sports. You know, Frank, maybe the biggest and longest ongoing story of this decade has been the usage of drugs. It started as recreational use. It was just a little nuisance. Now it's a big, big problem. You've got blood doping, steroids, enhancement drugs, which enhance performance. It's really a problem.
Yes, I think it took a long time for sports to understand that it was, first of all, just part of society. Recreational drugs, and particularly you're dealing with young people with money, who are the ones that we know are drug users. But the much greater issue is that of steroids. I mean, the greater issue for sports. And I think it's taken an awfully long time, particularly for the National Football League, to come to grips with the fact that perhaps as many as 50 or 60 or 70% of its players are dealing on steroids. They have not done the good job in dealing with steroids that the baseball and basketball have done with recreational drugs.
It seems to me as though the NBA really has been the only league that's had a substantive policy throughout the entire decade, and it's hard to imagine why.
Well, I think one of the reasons is that the NBA was the first league hit by drug problems. And to David Stern's credit, he responded and responded quickly. It took a little bit longer for the other leagues to come along, and I look for Commissioner Tagliabue to play some catch-up ball with drugs.
Frank, I'm really concerned on another issue regarding drugs, and that's the heroism thing. Ben Johnson falls, Dexter Manley falls, Michael Ray Richardson. A lot of kids looking up to a lot of people, and these athletes have not held up their end of the responsibility.
Well, I think somebody else who takes blame for that are the colleges. These are supposed to be the institutions of higher learning that we look up to. And instead, the kind of scandals and corruption that have taken place in college athletics during the 1980s have been absolutely frightening. And I just don't think that we can go on with college athletics the way that they are. I think we got to start paying the kids and paying them soon.
I would agree wholeheartedly with payment for athletes. And you know, the other thing, Frank, is a lot of people say, well, if I don't cheat, I don't win. That's a cop-out, and that's the wrong way to approach it.
But for all the talk of corruption, Jim, they still pay off on the ball field. And in college football, there were still some great teams of the 1980s. Alabama in 1980, Bear Bryant's last championship team. Oklahoma in 86, Penn State in 87, and Notre Dame more recently. But really, the University of Miami has to be considered the team of the decade.
You're exactly right, Frank. The University of Miami did emerge in the early 1980s under Howard Snellenberger. And Miami held off Nebraska on a two-point conversion in a great Orange Bowl game in 1984 for their first national championship in a game that'll go down as one of the best of all time. They beat Nebraska 31-30. Miami's quarterbacks in the 1980s were the best. Jim Kelly, now with Buffalo. Bernie Kosar, now with the Browns. Vinny Testaverde of Tampa Bay. And Steve Walsh, now with the Cowboys. Just great quarterbacks throughout the decade. They gave way, however, in 1987 to Penn State in a national championship game down in the Fiesta Bowl. Penn State had an interception at the end of the game, which stole the win. Jimmy Johnson took over for Snellenberger, but the tradition continued. Miami defeated Oklahoma in the 1988 Orange Bowl for the national championship. Every hair was in place until he was carried off the field with a 20-14 victory.
Now, Jim, I know we've anointed Miami as the team of the decade. I did myself, and there are certainly no cynics around here. But might I suggest that more appropriately, Oklahoma should be the team of the decade, inasmuch as the Sooners represent everything that is wrong with college football, and so much is wrong with college football.
I think you're right. Barry Switzer, among the fallen leaders around this world, much like the Shah, Ferdinand Marcos, Barry Switzer found his corruption too. But you know something? Let's go back to Miami. I think that maybe the best play of this decade happened to the Miami Hurricanes as they were done in by Doug Flutie.
Yeah, that's true, but for my money, player of the decade, not Flutie, the Cal Band. I'll take that one.
I love that play. I just wonder what song it was that they were playing. You know, there's still a lot of fun in college football, but it seemed like the trumpets have really been blaring. A big, big decade for college basketball.
Oh, the college football guys, they gave away the candy store. When we came into the 70s and 80s, college football reigned, but now the NCAA is on top, the NCAA basketball. There's no question that that's the biggest college sport now.
Frank, the decade began with BYU's Danny Ainge driving the length of the court in the regionals to defeat Notre Dame in the last seconds of the game.
I was in Atlanta that night, and it was more exciting in person than what you're seeing on the screen.
Couldn't have been more exciting, though, than in 1982. Georgetown against North Carolina. Patrick Ewing, a freshman. He was rejecting Carolina early, but it was Michael Jordan. He put that shot through for Carolina, led them to the win. But who can ever forget in that game Fred Brown and his errant pass to James Worthy and the consoling that he received from John Thompson?
And, of course, that was the game that told people that Dean Smith could win the big one.
Then in 1983, Clyde Drexler, Akeem Olajuwon, Guy Lewis's Phi Slamma Jamma. They dunked everyone except for Cinderella NC State in the NCAA Finals. Jim Valvano went crazy, couldn't find anyone to hug. Then 1985, what a story this was. Rolly Massimino, the little town comes through. Villanova shooting 78% from the field, stunned the very heavily favored Georgetown Hoyas.
This is an example of what I think's wrong with the NCAA is this was the third chance Villanova had during the year to beat Georgetown. You give anybody enough chances, they're going to win at some point.
You're right about that. 1987, Keith Smart only needed one shot, one chance. A last-second prayer that he threw up. Beautiful shot. Found the bottom of the net to defeat Syracuse 74-73. Then in 1989, one of the stranger stories in college basketball, Steve Fisher comes in and coaches Michigan just for the NCAA tournament. As Bill Frieder moves on to Arizona State, Bo Schembechler wants a Michigan man. He really finds it, however, in Glenn Rice as Michigan wins 80-79.
Can you believe it? In a decade, 5 championship games settled by less than a basket.
It really was quite a decade for college sports. It's been quite a decade for all of sports. And we're going to continue here with the decade in sports.
She's all ours.
Going into business, got something new. Gonna paint the town, red, white, and blue. Coming through this
Nice place. How about some customers?
ladies' night.
Great place, guys. Who did your decorating?
Stranded by a dead battery.
Oh, come on.
Not with Die-Hard Dual Start. It's 2 batteries in one. A simple twist taps its built-in spare Die-Hard for more power when you need it most. Die-Hard Dual Start.
I've been involved with the telethon and cerebral palsy clients for over 10 years now. I've seen firsthand how far these children and adults have come.
You soon realize how much love and care accompanies the therapy that's given these special people. I guess the lesson is that one caring person really can make a difference.
Join Brian and Cindy and take the time to care. Watch Starathon 90 this weekend on Channel 7 and make a pledge to United Cerebral Palsy.
Come on, Betsy, don't make Mommy late.
All right, Mommy.
You know, we've been on our own for a while now. At first, I thought I'd have to put all my dreams on the back burner, especially the one about the little house of our own. Then I heard about Sunny Mae's affordable housing program. It helped us put the key in the door to our new home. We've got it Sunny Made.
For low-cost mortgages, call 1-800-382-HOME.
Stranded by a dead battery.
Oh, come on.
Not with Die-Hard Dual Start. It's 2 batteries in one. A simple twist taps its built-in spare Die-Hard for more power when you need it most. Die-Hard Dual Start.
You know, we fans love to rail against all the bad things in sport, the drugs and the corruption, but sometimes we're part of the problem, too. And what I saw in stadiums and arenas in the United States in the 1980s was a lot less civility and a lot more ugliness. Now, the wave is basically a good, benign thing. But there are some people who use it, who say, hey, I'm the star. I bought a ticket. I'm much more important than those guys down on the field. And let me tell you, that's the very attitude that led to the tragedies and the deaths at European stadiums in the 1980s. And I saw much more of that in the United States in this past decade, and we better guard against it.
Welcome back, and now it's time for Hoops, Frank. And what we've seen in the NBA is the passing of the baton from Dr. J, Julius Erving, to Michael Jordan. But what we also have had is we've had some great personalities and great players, Bird and Magic, and it's really helped the league rise.
Oh, this has been a great decade for the NBA. Remember at the beginning, there was a lot of talk that basketball was too black. That has thankfully been diminished almost completely. The other thing that's helped the rise of the NBA is that it's become a theatrical sport. Basketball has become proud of being part of showbiz rather than being a little bit embarrassed by it.
And they should also be proud of the way they've handled themselves. A lot of the credit, they've had union and labor peace, coexistence. David Stern is to be commended. He's done a brilliant job, and he had a great, great partner in the late Larry Fleischer. And it just seems to me, Frank, as though the 1980s, the NBA has been on the rise since the very start. And it all started in 1980 with a great rookie crop coming in. That was Magic and Bird. They went straight from the NCAA championship in 1979 right into the NBA, and Bird won the Rookie of the Year. You know, also in that season, we saw the three-point play. It came over from the ABA, and it finally made its way into the NBA. In 1980, the sixth game of the finals, no one will ever forget that Magic played center. Here was a guy who was a guard, Frank, now playing center.
He's a 6'9" guard, I mean.
He scored 42 points, 15 rebounds in replace of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and the Lakers captured their first title with Magic. Then it was on to 1983, and one of the nicest stories and the best teams to come out of the decade. Finally, Julius Erving, Dr. J, got his championship ring with the 76ers. What a terrific cast. Moses Malone, Bobby Jones, Mo Cheeks, Andrew Toney, and the coaching of Billy Cunningham. 1984, David Stern became the commissioner. He took over for Larry O'Brien, and that was a big, big move for the league, Frank.
And there's no question about it. As you said, Stern and Fleischer working together made all the difference in the world.
Attendance up 50% in 5 years. Television revenues, everything has gone through the ceiling under David Stern's commissionership. In
not only that they're looking now for expansion teams. You couldn't give away expansion franchises 10 years ago.
Now they're all full in Charlotte, Miami, Orlando, and so forth. In 1984, we saw Michael Jordan. He entered the NBA All-Star Game, the slam dunk spectacle after the 1984 Olympics. He was soon to be scoring champion, and he captured the imagination of everyone. 1984 through 1987, big years in the NBA. Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics are in the finals for 4 consecutive years. They won 2. The thing that I think I'll remember, broke a lot of people's hearts and made a lot of people think that there was still that Celtic mystique, was against the Pistons when Larry Bird stole the ball, similar to Havlicek of many years gone by.
That was probably the single play of the 1980s in the NBA.
1988, Pat Riley, Kareem, and Magic coming back from back-to-back championships. First team since the '69 Celtics to do so. Kareem retired in 1989. It wasn't a glorious exit, however. He was swept away by the Detroit Pistons 4-0 to end the decade.
No way that you can avoid saying that the Lakers were team of the decade, unless you want to see that the Laker girls were the team of the decade.
Well, Frank, the Laker girls may have been the team of the decade, but my team of the decade was the 1983 Philadelphia 76ers. Remember Moses Malone? Faux. Well, they went through the playoffs, 12-1. Dr. J, Billy Cunningham in that game, in my opinion, were the team of the decade.
And before we leave the decade, let's remember the Detroit Pistons, and that brings us to another kind of Pistons, down where the rubber hits the road.
The NASCAR stock car leaders during the decade were Dale Earnhardt, Bill Elliott, Darrell Waltrip, and Rusty Wallace. For the first time in 1988, the drag racing 5-second barrier was broken. It's been broken 20 times since. These were the leaders: Joe Amato, Shirley Muldowney, Dick Leahy, and Darrell Gwynn. In Indy cars, well, that belonged to Rick Mears. It was his decade along with Bobby Rahal. Rahal had 19 championships. Mears had 20.
But when it came to the best races, Mears got beat. 1982, Gordon Johncock, after 500 miles, beats him by 1/16 of a second. And it was another close finish in the 1989 Indy when Emerson Fittipaldi beat Al Unser Jr. They were tire to tire with 2 laps to go when Fittipaldi came out of the turn and held on to win.
Going back to that 1982 Indy race, 1/16 of a second, that's what you people referred to as a photo finish.
Well, that's as close as you can get. But you know, auto racing continues to achieve popularity all around the world. I think there are 2 reasons for that. I think number 1, simply speed thrills. Another thing is that we're all used to cars these days, and that is a problem that horse racing suffers because most of us don't hang around horses these days. Nonetheless, there were a tremendous number of great horse races during the 1980s, and we'll talk about them right now.
Perhaps the moment of the decade was when Willie Shoemaker, the Shoe, won in 1986 the Kentucky Derby on Ferdinand. The innovation was the Breeders' Cup. It helps determine the yearly champion.
By the same token, I think it'd be very difficult to determine one horse of the decade in this particular sport, Jim. A spectacular bid started off with a great record in 1980. Ali Sheba won 2 of the 3 Triple Crown races, but there was no Triple Crown champion during the year. John Henry was everybody's old favorite, great old campaigner, won 26 races until he finally retired in 1984. But if I had to say the horse of the decade, I can't say it, but I'd say it was the fillies' decade. 2 of them, Genuine Risk and Winning Colors, won the Kentucky Derby, and there were a lot of other great fillies like Lady Secret, Personal Ensign, and All Along. For the first time, really, in American racing, the fillies competed with the colts and did so practically on equal terms. So it was a ladies' decade in horses.
Frank, perhaps you're right, but to me, the horse of the decade and the horse of a lifetime, we lost, and it was this year, and that was Secretariat, a horse that was a friend to all of us. We've got a lot more to come in the decade of sports, tennis, golf, and much more.
Hey, Mike, I really like this white Zinfandel.
Well, good, good. Now put it down. We're going to try another one.
He loves to do this.
This one's great. Yeah, I like it better. Why?
Can't it just taste better? Isn't that allowed?
Did you know Gallo made a white Zinfandel?
No, it's terrific, isn't it?
Hey, am I going to get any credit for this?
Ernest and Julio Gallo present a very special white Zinfandel. It will change the way you think about Gallo.
Once, there were a few proud men, men of adventure, men of courage, men who knew the meaning of honor. There still are, the Marines. We're looking for a few good men.
When it comes to covering the power plays in business, Carl Grant doesn't miss a beat. He's out there where the action is, on Capitol Hill, or in the corporate suite, up front and up close with the headline makers. Get the first word on business from the people making business news with Carl Grant and First Business.
Weekday mornings at 5:30 here on Channel 7.
United Cerebral Palsy is helping in your community, providing opportunities for all people. Be a caring person. Support cerebral palsy.
Hello again, everyone. I'm Jim Gray.
And I'm Frank Deford, and this is The Decade in Sport.
And Frank, you'll be taking on a new assignment after several years of writing novels and writing movies and working for Sports Illustrated. You've got a new task in front of you.
I'm the editor of a new paper, a daily sports newspaper. This is relative to what we're talking about, Jim. I believe that sports is so important in America that we're ready for an all-sports daily here.
You know, things really have grown. Used to be that the sports sections, which have grown tremendously, used to be the throwaway page, a lot like my golf game. But golf in the 1980s has really picked up steam. That putt gave Jack Nicklaus his 6th Masters at the age of 46. He gave life and hope to everybody that, in fact, life does begin after 40. It was his 22nd major win, 6 under par in the final 9 holes, one for the ages. Another one for the ages came in 1982. Tom Watson, in a memorable moment, stood on the 17th hole at beautiful Pebble Beach on the Monterey Peninsula and chipped it in for a U.S. Open championship. The impossible strokes continued in 1986 as Bob Tway sunk this one on the 18th hole to edge out Greg Norman for a PGA victory. Then in 1987, the unbelievable continues again on the 18th hole. Larry Mize once again does in the Australian Shark, beating Norman to chip in for the Masters. And Curtis Strange wins back-to-back U.S. Opens, the first man since Ben Hogan did so in 1950 and 51 by capturing the Open in 1988 and 89.
Jim, it's probably a reflection of demographics more than anything else as the population gets older, but the seniors golf tour has become more important than the LPGA. It's replaced the women in second place.
I think you're right, and you know, we have seen the seniors gaining this steam. We got Jack Nicklaus getting ready to go in there, Lee Trevino, Arnold Palmer. The seniors are the fun guys to watch anymore.
Speaking of seniors or almost seniors, I interviewed Jack 2 months before that Masters. We were at a putting, he was practicing putting, and he told me he thought he could win another one. And I came back and told everybody that the guy had really gone around the bend, 46 years old. No way. Yeah, I'll never bet against him again.
You showed your infinite wisdom there. A little more wisdom, Frank. Can anybody dominate the tour like Nicklaus did and Watson did in the early 80s?
Oh, probably not, and almost surely not, because golf is such an international game now. There's so many more good players from all over the world.
And as you say, golf is getting internationalized. Well, tennis has already become internationalized. And for the most part, Frank, the best players are not in the United States anymore.
Oh, slow down now. Maybe they're not now, but at least at the beginning of the decade, we had McEnroe, still had Connors, had Chrissy Everett. At that time, the U.S. still ruled.
And a man who lives in the United States has his green card. Yvonne Lendl began his reign in the 80s. Power and conditioning was his game. Lendl won 3 out of 6 straight U.S. Open finals. Martina Navratilova, she had her reign. She won 6 straight Wimbledons, won 4 out of 5 U.S. Opens in the middle of the decade. She was athleticism and conditioning, the first time a female had been so powerful.
But she never won the Grand Slam, which was her great quest. Came very close one year and lost in the quarterfinals of the Australian to Helen Sukova, her countrywoman. But later on, oddly enough, a younger woman, Steffi Graf, won the Grand Slam for the first time in 20 years since Maureen Connolly had, to begin the rule of the Germans. Steffi has won 7 of the last Grand Slam tournaments, would have won 8 in a row if she hadn't had menstrual pains in the French Open last year. And she's matched with Boris Becker, the other West German, who's won 3 of the last 5 Wimbledons and finished off 1989 by taking his first U.S. Open and clearly stands at the top of the heap now. The match of the decade, though, we've got to go way back to 1980. No question whatsoever, the match of the ages. Bjorn Borg versus John McEnroe, the final of Wimbledon in 1980. McEnroe won the classic tiebreaker in the 4th set, 18-16, but Borg won the match. But you know, Jim, no question in my mind, the best male player of the 1980s was still John McEnroe. And I'll match him up against Martina as the best female.
I wholeheartedly agree, and it was a great thing that she had Chris Evert. It established one of the great rivalries of all time in female tennis or in any sport.
And there we go again. We can't get away from it, Jim. Keep coming back to the subject of globalization in sports. That's the one trend that's clear all during the 80s.
Well, you're right, and we're seeing it more and more. We've got a Nigerian in the National Football League. We've got Soviets playing in the NHL. We've got Americans going over to Europe play. My question to you, Frank, though, is will Americans pay for foreigners? Will they pay to go and see them play?
I think we better learn, because the foreigners are oftentimes going to be the best. And if we've always settled only for the best in this country, and we better have now, and maybe it's going to teach us a lesson, Jim, because the world is going to be more competitive in the 90s. Europe is coming together in 92. We all know about Japanese and Asia. And maybe we can learn through sports that we've got our work cut out for us in the 1990s.
Will the Americans be forced out, in your opinion? Are we getting to the point where the best athletes won't be Americans anymore?
Well, if we're not, that's what the lesson that we have to learn. And maybe we've always thought that the world was just handed to us. And now there's going to be more competition, and our backs are going to be up against the wall.
And I know that you have a great concern about violence in stadia, and we've seen it around the world, particularly the tragedy in England this year, where a lot of people were trampled. With the violence that you're now seeing and the concerns you have in the stadiums here, is this to be something that could happen in the United States?
I think it's more of a societal problem than it is a sport problem. In other words, it isn't necessarily soccer that causes violence. It's the people who go to soccer games. I'm sort of an expert on that. I was tear-gassed 4 times watching a game between Holland and Belgium and France. But I always do worry about Americans becoming violent and suffering perhaps undue tragedies in lots of sports. We've got to guard against ourselves, and hopefully we will not see that in the World Cup this year anywhere. The World Cup is the second greatest event in world sports. The first greatest event, of course, is the Olympics. And we'll be back to talk about that.
It began as a game. turned into a battle. And now, it's out of control. Blood Bowl 2, coming January 28th. This time, it's war.
You were there,
you let me know you care.
It's important to recognize teachers who inspire us to do our best.
For the way that you inspired me. I like it. For the heart and soul you gave. I just want to say thanks. Thanks to teachers.
Join Channel 7 and our Time to Care corporate sponsors in saying thanks to teachers. Pick up a nomination form at any Apple computer store.
Some people think the National Guard is just an excuse for a bunch of guys to get together and have a good time. That they're not as trained or committed as other branches of the military. That they're weekend warriors, not real soldiers. And people wonder what business they have being in a foreign country. Well, I can't clear up all the misconceptions people have about the National Guard, so let me leave you with one important fact. If you bring together all the ready forces of the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and Reserves, you still have only half the picture. The other half? The National Guard. Skilled, capable, intelligent people. People like you and me. Americans at their best.
Welcome back to the Decade in Sports. I'm Jim Gray, along with Frank Deford. And Frank, really, the decade of the 80s was the decade of the Olympics. After being stifled in 1980 and 84 by boycotts, 1988, more countries participated in the Olympics than are in the United Nations. And it all began in 1980 in Lake Placid. Eric Heiden took 5 gold medals. Heiden's accomplishment, combined with the stunning victory for the gold by the United States Olympic hockey team, gave this country a tremendous high. That was all doused by Jimmy Carter. As president, he imposed a boycott on the Moscow Summer Games. 62 countries followed in line. But the games went on in Moscow anyway, and Tefilio Stevenson won yet another heavyweight gold medal. It was his third to go along with 1972 and 1976. In 1984, in the tiny little town of Sarajevo, Yugoslavia, Katarina Witt won her first of 2 gold medals in figure skating.
And then the Olympics moved on to Los Angeles for the first time in the United States in 52 years. Unfortunately, in a payback to the Carter boycott of 1980, 15 communist countries boycotted, including the Soviets and the East Germans. But all the Americans had a great time picking up on the gold medals that the Russians and East Germans left behind. Carl Lewis won 4 gold medals all by himself, duplicating the feat that Jesse Owens made originally in 1936. Unfortunately for Mary Decker, she was tripped in the 1,500 meters and did not win. But Mary Lou Retton became the prime female American athlete of the 1984 Games, winning the gymnastic gold. And Edwin Moses, who had to sit out the 1980 boycott, came back and won a gold medal again, duplicating his feat from Montreal in 1976.
And the Games stayed on the North American continent, returning to Canada. Calgary was the site for the Winter Games, and Brian Boitano won a figure skating duel between Brian Orser, and Katarina Witt repeated. The Summer Games shifted to Seoul, Korea, and it was the first time that a country hosted the Games who was not a member of the United Nations. Greg Louganis survived, hitting his head on the springboard, and went on to capture his second gold medal. The boxing venue proved to be the most hotly contested venue in Seoul, Korea. A number of incidents. Anthony Hembrick, an American, missed his fight. Then in the finals, Roy Jones was robbed when the judges awarded a Korean boxer the gold medal. For fashion at the track, the year belonged to Florence Griffith Joyner, Flo-Jo. She set 1 world record and captured 3 gold medals. The sight of Flo-Jo in her fashion was a sight to behold, but really the Olympics, Frank, owe themselves in this decade to Peter Ueberroth. He came up with over a $200 million surplus after really nobody wanted to host the Olympic Games. He found a way to make these things profitable.
Yeah, Montreal had just about had to mortgage itself to the rest of the world after the 76 Games, and then, of course, there were boycotts in 80, in 84. Now everybody and his brother is standing in line. Every city in the world wants to get the Olympics.
I think the most uplifting moment, though, in the 1980s had to be the American hockey team in Lake Placid.
I don't think you can get away from that. I think that it sure was a long time ago. But that was such an upset. You know, I think what made it so important was the United States is not used to being the underdog. Sure, we won a lot of big battles, but this was a time where we were the little country fighting up against that big, ugly Russian bear. And oddly enough, hockey started in this decade with the United States playing against Russia, and now it's the NHL and Russia as the decade comes to an end.
But it was much too soon for the Russians to have any impact on the Islanders. They won 4 consecutive Stanley Cups to begin the decade. Coached by Al Arbor, Billy Smith was in goal. 4 in a row for the Islanders, which has only been done twice before, and that was by Montreal. Wayne Gretzky joined the Edmonton Oilers, and he changed the game forever. He won 9 of 10 MVP awards, the greatest hockey player in history, having passed Gordie Howe. And with his club, the Edmonton Oilers, he was able to dominate in the middle of the 80s. The Oilers won 2 championships with Gretzky.
Really, I believe that Gretzky, the Canadian, is that important to American audiences. And perhaps there's one American who's been that important to foreign audiences, and that's Greg LeMond in cycling. No American had ever won the Tour de France before, and LeMond won it not once, but twice in the 1980s.
He also captured the World Championships this year. But when we come back, Frank, you know what we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about America's pastime.
Baseball.
We're talking baseball when we come back.
You know the sinking feeling of a dead battery.
Mommy, what's wrong? Just stay in the car.
Now there's the revolutionary Die-Hard Dual Start. It's 2 Die-Hard batteries in one. A simple twist taps its built-in spare Die-Hard, so you're not left stranded.
Mom, you fixed it.
It's cutting-edge technology, and it's Die-Hard. Die-Hard Dual Start. More power when you need it most.
People who want that competitive edge also want the nutrition of 100% whole grain. But of these leading cereals, only Wheaties is made with 100% whole grain. So only Wheaties gives you whole grain nutrition. Better get your whole grain.
You better eat your Wheaties.
Now with 25% less sodium than before.
The Big Zero. That's the finance charge at Highland for 1 full year on everything, from audio and video to home office equipment and appliances. 0% for 1 full year. In fact, everything you've ever wanted is at Highland Superstore's 0% financing event, except, of course, the interest payments. And by the way, it's now through Monday only.
Live with Regis and Kathy Lee. It's a party and everyone's invited. It's going to be fun. It's going to be silly and the entertainment will thrill you. Good. It's going to be great. And on the next Live, Donna Mills tells us how she's keeping busy since her Knots Landing Day. And we'll get a lesson in rapping from the hippest rapper around, Big Daddy Kane.
Watch Regis and Kathy Lee Monday morning at 9 on Channel 7.
I'm Frank Deford with Jim Gray, back with sports in the 80s. And the 80s were an absolutely fabulous time for the sport of baseball. Baseball has always been a game of reveries, of father and son, of pastoral dreams. But more than ever in this very technological age, baseball has been able to position itself as a family game.
And you know, Frank, people who've kept the family together in this decade, there have been 4 commissioners, 4 stewards. That's as many as baseball has had in its entire history. Your thoughts? First, Bowie Kuhn.
Bowie Kuhn was a guy who looked much stuffier as a commissioner than he really was. He was a much better guy than he appeared. He shepherded baseball well through a transitional period, and when he gave it over to Peter Ueberroth, the commissioner had much more power.
If Bo knows football and baseball, Peter Ueberroth knows money.
He was the best business commissioner that any sport has ever had.
Let's move forward to, of course, a favorite of yours, the late Bart Giamatti.
I think an awful lot of people understand that Giamatti could have been the best commissioner that any sport ever experienced because he loved the game so much and seemed to understand it and its people.
And he was so deep with the passion for the game. Fay Vincent now.
I think that everything we've seen about Mr. Vincent indicates that he has great, great promise and can carry on the Giamatti heritage.
And Frank, these stewards, these fathers of the game, these commissioners, they remain in the background, and the 80s was great on the field.
Well, the 80s began with a guy that I think some of us still remember named Pete Rose. Rose was on the Phillies in 1980, and he led the Philadelphia team to its first World Series in 30 years when the Whiz Kids lost to the Yankees. That year, 1980, the Phillies beat Kansas City, and at last, the city of brotherly love had a world champion. In 1982, Rickey Henderson, who's still very much with us, set the Major League stolen base record of 119, breaking Lou Brock's single-season record of 118. Here we go again. 1985, Pete Rose finally broke Ty Cobb's 47-year-old hit record. Cobb had gotten 4,191 hits when Rose got this single that put him ahead. In 1986, perhaps the single most exciting game, at least in the postseason, the Mets and Astros played 14 innings in the National League Championship Series. The Mets won the game and went on to the World Series.
Another Philly was in the news, Michael Jack Schmidt. He hit his 500th home run. Then in 1988, it was Orel Hershiser's chance to make history. He broke Don Drysdale's record of 59 consecutive scoreless innings. Nolan Ryan got his 5,000th strikeout to become the all-time leader. The man he struck out? Rickey Henderson. In 1983, George Brett played a role in one of the most famous episodes of all of baseball in this decade, the Pine Tar incident, the Pine Tar home run against the Yankees. One of baseball's original traditions, in fact, one of the last bastions, went down the drain. Chicago's Wrigley Field got lights in 1987. A funny incident, Joe Niekro was caught with an emery board. Then the most somber news of the decade, Pete Rose was banned from baseball for gambling. He went from top to bottom. Frank, I know that that's our worst moment of the decade. What's your best moment of the decade in baseball?
Well, I wouldn't say it was the best, and certainly it's not the best if you're a Red Sox fan, but the most significant, momentous moment of the 1980s was when the ground ball went through Bill Buckner's legs at first base. The Red Sox are up 3-2. They're 1 out away from winning their first World Series since Babe Ruth played with the team, and they couldn't put the Mets away. 2 out, nobody on. The ball goes through Buckner's legs, and ultimately the Mets win the World Series.
Frank, that sure was heartbreaking. Mine is heartbreak of a different manner. I disagree with your play. I think the biggest play of the decade, right out of the natural. It had Babe Ruth written all over it, Frank. Kurt Gibson stepped up there against the Oakland A's, took a swing at the bat with the bad knee. He couldn't run. He was hobbled. He was down to his last pitch, and boom, he smacked it out of there. The Dodgers won Game 1 of the World Series. They went on to capture the 1988 World Series.
That didn't have just Babe Ruth written all over it. That had King Arthur written all over it. Camelot. But now we leave the sweet sport of baseball for the seamy one of boxing.
Frank, you're right. It may be seamy, it may be grimy, and it may be grubby.
All of the
above. But let me tell you something. Okay, all of the above. Throw in everything else you want that's uncouth. But let me tell you something. There's nothing better than a great prize fight, even now.
I'll grant you that. All I'm saying is that boxing's in trouble. The day-to-day part of the sport is gone. I mean, now that all the old guys, Sugar Ray and Hearns and Hagler and all that crowd have beaten each other up, there's nothing left really but Tyson and Don King. That's boxing. But I tell you what,
You sound like the AMA. What do you call it, the abolition of boxing? You're like the AMA.
No, but I tell you what, I'm going to let you show the people all the good fights from the 1980s. How about that?
And there were some great fights. It started with Ray Leonard against Tommy Hearns, the Hitman, back in 1981 at Caesar's Palace. And in the late rounds, the late going, Ray Leonard was able to knock out Tommy Hearns. Then it was Leonard against Duran, too. The very famous no mas, no mas. Without explanation, in the 8th round, Duran just quit. Manos de Piedro, no more. Then it was Hagler against Hearns, Income Tax Day, 1985. One of the great fights of all time. It only lasted 9 minutes, but what a great 3 rounds as the Marvelous One took it away. Ray Leonard made a comeback. He fought Marvelous Marvin Hagler. No one expected Ray Leonard, who'd been out of the ring for so long, to put up a fight, but he was able to handle and win the Marvelous One in a decision. Mike Tyson became the king of boxing, and he was the knockout king. In his fight against Michael Spinks and others, it's really been no match. That one, a paltry 91 seconds.
Thank you, Jim, and so we say no mas to boxing. One thing let's give credit to boxing for, if you're on top, there's more money in boxing than there is anywhere else in sports.
And Frank, you really don't even need to be on top anymore to make a lot of money in sports. It's big business for everybody, fans and players. But I think what we've seen in the 80s is there's really no more such thing as amateurism.
Oh, thank the Lord for that. That was one of the great ersatz red herrings of all time. The idea that a guy had to play a game for nothing to love it. It was actually invented, the whole concept, by the British in the 19th century, the British upper class, to keep the lower class in its place, to keep them off the field. And for some reason, the whole world took it up. And I just think if a guy is good at something, let him get paid for it.
And exactly, that's what's being practiced now in the colleges. It's high time. They've got to end this in the 90s. Quit what's gone on for years. You got to pay these guys. The other thing that's a bit appalling to me is, why are we forcing these people to go to college and go to school? If I want to be a journalist, I can go to school and learn how to become a better communicator. If you want to be a businessman, you can go run the National. Why are we forcing these kids to study psychology when they want to be football and basketball players?
Well, it also doesn't make any sense if coaches are making literally hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and good for them. And the universities are making millions of dollars a year just for putting the teams on television. It doesn't follow at all in America that the athletes should be getting absolutely nothing at all, except, I believe, $15 a month for books and laundry.
Well, can the bubble burst? We've seen it become such a big business. We're talking about amateurism. They're not sharing in. But what about the rest of sports? Will the bubble burst?
I don't see any sign of it. That's not to say that it won't happen. Of course, the sports economy is tied in with the general economy. But assuming that everything continues along the same sort of path, I see no reason to think that things are going to slump off. If anything, more and more companies are tying themselves in with sports because it's good business.
Frank, that's right, but as ticket prices continue to increase and the average guy gets priced out of the market, let's hope that the administrators of sports, in all sports, keep things, the big events, on free television. When we come back, we'll summarize the decade and have our picks of the top athletes and coaches of the 80s.
Here's the last stop on our tour, the Fountain of Youth.
This one's on me.
How about a nice cold bud, young man?
I love this job.
Once, there were a few proud men of adventure, men of courage, men who knew the meaning of honor. There still are, the Marines. We're looking for a few good men.
It's Seaway Pools and Recreational Warehouse's sales event of the year on swimming pools and spas and hot tubs. For above-ground pools, it's our annual free installation sale, where you get a complete 24-foot pool package for just $8.99 installed. 18-foot kits are only $7.99 installed, and there's plenty more. For spas and hot tubs, it's our once-a-year 2-for-1 sale, where you get 2 complete spas for just $19.99. Bring a friend, find a friend, or take 40% off for one. So hurry to Recreational Warehouse or Seaway Pools now.
They're finally drafting a plan for NFTA funding, and we'll take a look at it Monday morning at 10. I'm Brian Kale.
And I'm Cindy Abbott. Also on Monday, Hot Men's Fashions from Harry Rosen.
Tuesday, Paula Masada teaches you how to make homemade pasta.
Wednesday, Governor Mario Cuomo explains and defends his new budget.
On Thursday, a new way of showing Buffalo to the rest of the country.
Plus, all week long, you'll have a chance to win $777 in cash and trivia prizes worth $200.
All on AM Buffalo, weekday mornings at 10 on Channel 7.
Now it's that time you've all been waiting for. We've been waiting for it. Everybody out there, get your pen and paper, this important stuff. Frank, your best team of the decade.
Oh, I'm going to shock people with this one. The East German Olympic team. A country 1/15 the size of the United States won far more gold medals in both the Winter and Summer Olympics.
Far more profound than anything that I could say, but I'm going to go with the 1985 Chicago Bears. They were fun. They had a great coach, Jim McMahon, the Fridge, Walter Payton. I love that team. All right, your favorite moment of the decade, Frank?
That was when Jim Craig, after the United States hockey team, beat the Russians, and he walks around and he says, "Where's my father? Where's my father? I'll never forget that.
A beautiful, beautiful sight. I'm also going to go for an Olympic moment, Frank. Mary Lou Retton, when she jumped over the vault in 1984 to capture the all-around title, following in the footsteps of Olga Korbut and Nadia Comaneci. And I can always remember Bella Caroli hollering, Mary Lou, Mary Lou, Mary Lou, get over here. One of the great, great moments. All right, your top coach of the decade, Frank.
This is kind of the toughest one of all. I thought about a lot of people. Herb Brooks, Whitey Herzog, Bill Walsh, Bobby Knight. Finally, tough ballot, Pat Riley of the Los Angeles Lakers.
You'd have a hard time getting anybody to argue with that 5 championships. Of course, I thought of Bill Walsh and all those too. I'm going to surprise you here. I'm going to go with Joe Paterno. He's won with dignity, class, and most importantly, honesty. And he did it twice, in 83 and 87.
Fair enough.
All right, we move on. The top personality of the decade, Frank.
This one I had fun with. I thought of the refrigerator. I thought of Bo Jackson. I thought of Don King. But finally, when it was all over, I came down to John McEnroe. Maybe it was because I was covering tennis early in the 80s. It was like Bud Collins once said about McEnroe, you had to have been there. Well, I was there.
I'm going to go for a guy who left his sport in 1987. Dr. J, Julius Erving. He transformed the league. He brought the ABA into the NBA. He won a championship in 83. He had a farewell tour. And again, he did it with dignity and class. He didn't stay too long. And to me, he was the top personality. He really is responsible for the rise in basketball. Okay, top male athlete of the decade.
This is easy. Wayne Gretzky, no question.
Absolutely concurred. Wayne Gretzky, an international treasure in my opinion. Okay, top female.
That was a little bit harder, but I went for someone who led the field like Gretzky for the longest period of time, and I picked Katarina Witt of East Germany.
You like those East Germans?
Well, it worked out that way, but the fact of the matter is they won, and that's what we're talking about.
The wall has come down even on this show.
You know, that's an interesting thing that I'm picking the East Germans because we'll never see their likes again, will we? Will we? Society has moved on from that.
That's exactly right, and I'm going to pick a Czech who's now an American, Martina Navratilova. She dominated her sport for an awful long time, and boy, she was awfully, awfully good, and we sure have enjoyed Martina Navratilova.
Interesting you should pick Martina. One time joking, she said in the field of human genetics, if she and Wayne Gretzky had a baby, look out for that kid.
That would really be a world champion everything. So, Frank, we've had it all. We've had cheating, we've had drugs, we've had strikes, steroids, corruption, greed, and even television timeouts. But what I'll remember is the human excellence, the human drama, the true glory of sports. Being all you can be was exhibited on so many fields and so many courts.
Sports, you know, go in and out of fashion like hemlines and television shows now. They'll go up and down, but I don't see any great changes in the world. I think that soccer, perhaps, is on for hard times. I think that the world is getting more interested in American sport than ever before, and that's going to carry us through the 1990s.
Frank, it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, Jim.
We hope you've enjoyed the decade of the 80s. We sure have.
The Decade in Sports has been brought to you by Budweiser. Beechwood aged for that clean, crisp taste. This Bud's for you. And by the U.S. Marine Corps. The few, the proud, the Marines.
Why are more and more American homes replacing their old drafty windows with Omni?
Omni features are fabulous.